Okay, I got the quilting done. I washed it, laid it flat to dry, and then I trimmed the edges. That's what I trimmed off. So I've got nice straight edges now. Next step is to do the binding. So I'm going to cut some narrow strips of that same silk that I made the frame with, and that'll be the binding, and I'll show you that in a bit. So these are strips that I cut of that fabric. I cut them at 1 3/4 inches. Now I'm going to press it. I'll fold it in half, press that, and then that gets sewn onto the quilt. I'll show you that when I get to it, but it's going to be a narrow binding. On a normal quilt, I usually do 2.5-inch wide strips, but I just want this to be real narrow. So it'll be harder to put on, but I think it'll be worth it. Anyway, I'll be back with sewing it on in a bit. So, for the binding, again, I cut this the strip 1 3/4 inches. I did where I joined it. I did it at 45 degrees, and to start, I start on one side of the quilt, not on a corner, but somewhere in the middle. And I'm going to leave myself a good, foot 18 inches unsewn, because when I join the ends together, I'm going to need that. So I have switched my machine to a standard foot, not the quilting foot that I had on it, but now I've just got a regular foot. The one I picked I like because it's not technically speaking a 1/4 inch foot, but if I line the edge of the quilt up with the edge of that foot, that usually does it for me without getting too technical. The cut edge of the fold goes on the outside, right up against the edge of the quilt. Now I trimmed it right up to the edge. Sometimes some people will leave a little bit of the extra of the depending on how full you want your binding and how wide you want it. You may not trim it quite as close as I did, so that you'd have more batting and backing inside it. But I want this to be real narrow, so I get my my binding right up to the edge. Now I am probably going to have to readjust my stitch length. These old machines, the stitch length regulator does not have numbers on it, so you just have to kind of play with it. I had it at 0 when I was doing the quilting, but now that I'm doing the binding, I'm going to need to adjust it. I am using the same thread for the binding as I did for the quilting on the gold, just because I figured it would match really nicely. So I need to the other thing is, just recently, in fact, just a few minutes ago, I changed the belt because my old one came apart again. The last time it broke, I just kind of taped it together because I didn't want to deal with it. Well, now I've got a new one on and it's loose. So it takes a little more effort to get it rolling the way I want. So I might have to actually do a little bit of that with my hand, because it is slipping a little bit. And that stitch length is just a bit too short, so let me lengthen that up a bit. And I could even do a little bit more. the oh, that's better. The binding will get folded over to the back and stitched down to the back, and that will be the finish. I will sometimes do a machine stitched binding, in which case I sew it on the back and then bring it over to the front and then top stitch it. But I thought this would be, I kind of like the way this quilt turned out so far, and I thought, well, a little hand stitching on the back, I do think it makes for a little bit nicer of a finish. So that's how I'm going to do it. Even though I'm not a big fan of hand stitching on binding. In fact, binding is really, honestly, it's my least favorite part. But let me just get to a corner. I'll show you how I do that. And then when I get around all the way, I'll show you how I join the two ends. The last thing I'm going to do after I'm completely done is I'm going to really examine all over the whole quilt and look for any areas where I've got threads that I didn't trim or cut or finish in the right way in the middle of the quilting, and see if there's any additional spots that I missed where I want to put a few stitches of quilting in it, like on right around Teddy's nose. I see a spot that I'd really rather have a little bit more stitching in. So even though it looks like it's going to be done, there's a little bit more I think that I'm going to do, but I wanted to get this binding on first. Because I was anxious to see how it would look without all that extra hanging off the edges. Now, I don't pin this, I just adjust as I go, and I don't make a big deal about what to do with all of this. It's on the floor, and I don't see any reason to go to all kinds of crazy lengths to wrap it around something or figure out a special gadget or anything to make it in a neat little pile. I've seen people hang things around their neck that holds the binding in, that it can unroll from, and I don't understand it. It's not going anywhere if I leave it piled up in a puddle on the floor, and it pulls up as I move around. It's never in the way. I've never had it tangle up. So I don't feel like, I think sometimes we get too carried away with feeling the need to have extra stuff when you don't need it. So I'm a big proponent of the less gadgets I need, the better. So I throw the binding in a pile on the floor, and it just feeds itself up as I need it. Not a problem. So I'm approaching the corner here. Now, what I need to do is I need to have the stitching stop 1/4 of an inch in from both sides. So what I want to do is just so I stop at the right point, I'm going to mark that spot with a pin so I know where to stop. Now, another way to do it, actually even easier perhaps, is to fold that over at a 45 degrees like that. So it's right, that angle is right along the edge. Now if I finger press that in there, it gives me a line there. And if I were to stop exactly at where my needle hits the line, and I know that this this fabric doesn't show a crease real good, so it's hard to see it. So you won't be able to see it on the camera, I'm sure. So anyway, so if you do it with a pin, or if you do the crease method, or you could mark it, whatever, you just want to stop a 1/4 of an inch from the end, both directions. And be careful not to sew your pin. This machine can sew through probably a nail, it's so strong, but it's still not good for your needle to sew through a pin. Now, with my needle down 1/4 of an inch from the inside edge, if I pivot this to 45 degrees and sew off the end, that makes the corner easier, I find. You don't have to do that. You can just stop there and instead of sewing off the edge, but I like to do that. Now, turn this whole quilt around, and from here, I'm going to take that binding and pull it up to this position. So this and the edge of the quilt, the other edge of the quilt, are parallel with each other. And then I'm going to fold it down again. And I could, if I want, pin that. I can hold it with my finger, so it's not a big deal. Now, to start the stitching, you're going to want, if I can pick up this pin, I can show you. You're going to want to be, again, 1/4 of an inch in this way and that way. So it's going to match. That spot where you start stitching should line up with that spot where you ended. That's going to make a nice mitered corner. Now, if you're better than me, which I imagine many of you are, and you're real careful and measure everything, your corners may turn out better than mine. I am not the best when it comes to marking and measuring, and so things don't always turn out perfect. But that's how I go around a corner. Now, I am going to do the same thing all the way around until I get to the other side. And then I will come back and show you how I join the two ends and finish it off. Be back soon. So I've got this is where the two ends need to join. So I don't remember when I started, I didn't sew it all the way on. So if I line this up with the edge, and then this other edge, and again I went around and did all 4 mitered corners, now I just have to join these two ends. But if I put these two right on top of each other, now I'm going to use a piece of the end here as a measurement. So if I take this and unfold it, and I put that on top of that, that gives me how much longer I need to make this piece than that piece. So again, let me just make sure I've got this right smooth and everything. Then I'll use this to measure, and then I'll cut. Now, if I join these two pieces together, then I'll be able to sew it straight down. So the way these get sewed together is like you would join your normal binding strips. They go like this, and you sew from there to there, and then it miters across. Now in this case, because this is connected and it's kind of hard to hold it flat, because you're going to have to kind of maneuver to get it into the machine the right way, you may in fact find that it's helpful to pin that before you go and get it in there and stitch it. We'll see here how I do. Now it's nothing fancy, it's just a and I always eyeball this. You may feel more comfortable, and it may be better to draw the 45-degree line that you need to follow rather than just eyeball sewing across it. So there's the seam, and then that's how it's joined. And if I pull it open, you can see that will seam it up just perfectly. Now all I have to do is I still have to trim this extra off, press it, and get it nice and flat before I sew it. But that's the basic idea. In fact, rather than stopping and starting again, I'll just pretend that I probably should press this. I don't want to, I could finger press it maybe. Yeah, that'll be fine. Yeah. Now, I probably will have to spend a few hours, because I'm not very fast at it, a few hours sewing the binding to the back. I'll show you that in a second. I just want to get this finished getting this stitched down. And this is strip grain binding. I cut the strips with the fabric. You could certainly make bias binding, but when I'm doing straight edges, I prefer straight grain fabric. I think I get a better, straighter edge that way, less likely to stretch out of shape. But certainly, there is a school of thought that says when you make straight grain binding. It is not as long lasting as bias binding. So if you're going to use it as a bed quilt, you may in fact want to use bias. I don't think it matters, but I'm not going to go against 100 years of tradition either. So what I'll do is fold this around to the back and stitch it down, and that's how wide that binding will be. Pretty narrow. Because I didn't want it to look too and here's how those miters work. You bring that around like that, and that makes the miter from the way we sewed it. So I got to do that, and this is all going to be blind stitched by hand to the back. And again, that's going to take me some time. I will use matching thread so it won't show, and that will be the finish. And I'll show you that after I get it all sewed down, and then we should be done. So there's the finished quilt. I have to flatten it out a little bit. It kind of bunched up from quilting, but you can see how the binding turned out. Just a nice narrow binding out of the same fabric, so it sort of makes that that gold look like well, my goal was to make it look like a picture frame. I think it did pretty good. Again, I'm going to have to do a little steaming to get it flat because I had it sort of wadded up in a ball while I was hand stitching the binding to the back. That's how it's stitched down. And anyway, there's the teddy quilt. Happy quilting.